The UN's Deputy Special Envoy for Syria told the Security Council in late 2025 that the situation remained extremely serious, and yet the press conferences looked nothing like that. Washington smiled, Brussels applauded, Riyadh and Doha wrote checks. The Caesar Act, the sweeping American sanctions law that had strangled Syria's trade for years, was repealed in December 2025. The EU followed with its own economic rollback in May. Diplomats called it a turning point. The headlines used the word historic. Meanwhile, inside Syria, a loaf of bread cost more than a teacher earns in a day. Gross national income per capita had fallen to just $830 in 2024, well below the threshold for low-income countries, with GDP having cumulatively contracted by more than 50% since 2010. The Syrian pound had already lost 99% of its value across the war years. The World Bank itself acknowledged that economic data from Syria is scarce and difficult to verify, which should tell you something about who was actually running the numbers. Here is what the sanctions narrative was always hiding. The foreign economic pressure was real, but it was also convenient. For 14 years, every failed harvest, every collapsed hospital, every empty shop shelf got one answer. The Americans did this. Sanctions were the regime's best excuse. They were the cover story for a government that had already looted its own country dry. When the cover story was removed, what remained was the truth. Syria was not a country waiting to recover. It was a captured state, one where the economic machinery had been deliberately rewired to feed a small group at the top. The sanctions did not build that machine, they just gave it a villain to hide behind. The celebrations were for a door opening. Nobody looked at what was standing on the other side. The World Bank's best estimate puts the cost of rebuilding Syria at $216 billion, nearly 10 times the country's entire GDP from 2024. Infrastructure alone accounts for $82 billion of that total. Cities like Aleppo and Homs are not damaged, they are rubble. Entire blocks were reduced to concrete dust and rebar. The contracts to rebuild them went out almost immediately after the regime fell. What followed was not a construction boom, it was a carve-up. Cronyism was already endemic under Assad, with the majority of the economy monopolised by government members or their affiliates. As the war economy emerged after 2011, crony capitalism deepened its hold. The same networks that captured the economy during the war were first in line when the rebuilding contracts were distributed afterward. They had the political relationships. They had the enforcers. What they did not have was the capital or the competence to actually build anything. Reports confirm that the restructuring of the Syrian economy and redistribution of Assad-held assets remain reliant on many of the same business figures as under the previous regime. So a loyalist firm wins the contract to rebuild a neighbourhood in Aleppo. It does not have the funds to start. It cannot attract outside investors because it controls access to the site and will not allow competitors inside. The rubble sits. The neighbourhood waits. The contractor collects fees for permissions and access. The violence of the gatekeeping is invisible to the cameras, but the people trying to bring in equipment or capital feel it immediately. The hardest hit regions, Aleppo, rural Damascus and Homs, require the largest share of capital to restore basic economic function. That capital cannot enter. The monopolies are the wall. If you're finding this useful, subscribe and hit the bell. There is much more inside this story than the headlines will ever give you. Imagine you secure a contract to rebuild a hospital in Damascus. You have the money. You have the permits. You go looking for the engineers. They are in Germany. The architects are in Canada. The electrical contractors are in Sweden. The surgeons who would eventually staff the hospital are in the Gulf. The country that needs rebuilding exported its brain before the bombs stopped falling. The professions most needed to rebuild Syria are engineers, architects, power grid specialists, doctors, teachers, and administrative staff. The Syrian diaspora, which represents the core of the brain drain, could play a key role through entrepreneurship. The problem is that returning requires more than a plane ticket. It requires a reason. UNICEF reports that only 57% of hospitals are fully functional, and only 37% of primary healthcare centres are operating at full capacity. The very infrastructure that would attract skilled professionals back is the infrastructure that needs those same professionals to fix it. The loop has no entry point. Before the conflict, Syria produced engineers and doctors who supplied the entire Arab world. It was a net exporter of expertise. The war ended that. 14 years of targeted attacks on hospitals, universities and professional networks dismantled the institutional foundations that take generations to build. You cannot summon them back with a sanctions announcement. The exodus of educated and skilled Syrians depleted the workforce across bureaucracy, educational institutions, factories, and most critically, the medical sector. Capital without labour builds nothing. Money pooling at the border with no qualified hands on the other side is not investment, it is a waiting room. The foreign investor looking at Syria in 2025 is not looking at a country ready to receive capital. He is looking at a labour market that does not exist anymore. While the formal economy was disintegrating, a different economy was running perfectly. It had production lines, distribution networks, foreign sales teams, and loyal clients across the Middle East, Europe, and beyond. The product was Captagon, a synthetic amphetamine, and at its peak the trade generated an estimated $9 billion annually, making it a central engine of Syria's shadow economy. To put that in context, Syria's entire formal GDP in 2024 was around $21 billion. The drug economy was not a side operation. It was close to half the country's real economic output. The Assad military's elite 4th Division, led by Bashar's brother Maher, ran the core of the production network. When the regime fell, new authorities cracked down on those specific factories. But other Captagon bosses were left untouched. One of them, Imad Abu Zureik, was sanctioned by Washington in 2023 for using his militia to sell contraband, operate protection rackets, and smuggle drugs into Jordan. After the regime fell, Syria's new leadership met with him to discuss his role in the incoming government. That is not a reconstruction story. That is a franchise changing hands. Between December 2024 and September 2025, Syrian forces dismantled 7 laboratories, raided 23 warehouses, and seized over 200 million Captagon pills. Those numbers sound significant until you realise the trade had been distributing billions of pills per year for over a decade. The enforcement is a performance, not a dismantling. The people who profited from Captagon do not want a functioning formal economy. A formal economy creates tax records, banking trails, and regulatory oversight. The shadow economy offers none of those inconveniences. Keeping the legal economy weak and ungoverned is not a side effect of the drug trade. It is the business model. International donors gathered in Brussels in March 2025 and pledged €5.8 billion for Syria's recovery. The UN Humanitarian appeal for Syria of $3.2 billion remained only 29% funded as of December 2025. The money that did arrive entered a country with a central bank that was not operating like a central bank. It was operating like a toll booth. Here is how the extraction works. Foreign currency enters Syria through aid organisations, NGOs, or international relief programs. The central bank sets an official exchange rate for converting those dollars into Syrian pounds. That official rate is significantly lower than the real market rate. The aid organisation converts at the official rate, the regime captures the difference, and the people the money was sent to help receive a fraction of the intended value. The dollars move upward. The poverty stays where it is. The World Bank warned in mid-2025 that frozen assets and restricted access to international banking continued to hinder energy supply, humanitarian support and trade and investment even after sanctions were lifted. The banking infrastructure was never rebuilt because a functional, transparent banking sector would make the exchange rate manipulation visible and stoppable. The US foreign aid freeze in January 2025 was especially damaging because the US had accounted for 30 to 40% of humanitarian funding in recent years. But even before the freeze, billions of dollars in annual aid were being funneled through a system designed to skim the top before anything reached the population. 3 out of 4 Syrians depend on humanitarian aid and development support. That dependence is not an accident. It is the architecture of control. A population that cannot survive without external handouts cannot organize to resist the people managing those handouts. The checkpoint did not disappear when the war ended. It just got a company registration number. For over a decade, the roads into and out of Syria's major cities were controlled by armed factions. Each one took a cut. Trucks paid tolls to move. Goods were taxed, confiscated, or held until the right payment arrived. The phrase used for this was informal taxation. A cleaner phrase would be extortion. Syria remains a high-risk jurisdiction due to endemic corruption, state institution collapse, narco-trafficking, insufficient anti-money laundering efforts, and inadequate controls against terrorism financing. The institutions that would normally absorb or displace these actors, courts, police, a functioning civil service, were either destroyed or were already captured by the same networks they were supposed to regulate. When the regime fell, the militia commanders did not disarm. They registered businesses. The checkpoints became logistics companies. The protection rackets became consulting fees. The supply chain choke points they had controlled with rifles were now controlled through contracts and licensing relationships. The physical power remained. Only the paperwork changed. The economic restructuring that followed familiar patterns: expropriation, reprivatization, and transactions run through front companies, all feeding into the same networks. A foreign company trying to move construction equipment from the port to Aleppo does not get stopped by a man with a gun anymore. It gets stopped by a permit requirement, a new licensing fee, a sudden regulatory complication that resolves itself once the right phone call is made. The supply chain toll is now invisible. The cost is the same. Before you can run a factory, you need power. Before you can power a hospital, you need a grid. Before you can build a grid, you need to find out what happened to the one that was already there. It was sold. Piece by piece, over 14 years. Copper wiring stripped from transmission lines. Transformers removed and traded. Generating equipment cannibalized for parts or sold across borders. The World Bank reports that years of conflict have reduced electricity supply to only 2 to 4 hours a day in many areas. That is not a grid in need of repair. That is a grid that was actively dismantled while the war provided cover. Restoring the grid will require an estimated $1.5 billion and at least 5 years, according to government figures accessed by Karam Shah Advisory Limited. Concerns are also growing that the energy sector has become entangled in politics and potential corruption. A $7 billion energy investment deal signed by Turkish, Qatari and US companies in May 2025 promised to significantly boost Syria's electricity supply. There is no independent confirmation that capacity has actually improved on the ground. 2 electricity-generating ships from Turkey and Qatar were reported en route in January 2025, but no evidence of their arrival or integration into the grid has emerged. Promises of power and delivery of power are 2 separate economies in Syria. The announcement is for the press release. The cables are for whoever controls the cable. The Alomar oil field, reclaimed by the transitional government in late 2025, had seen production collapse to around 14,200 barrels per day, with reservoirs under severe stress. Rehabilitation faces immense technical and financial hurdles. No factory runs on a diplomatic communique. No hospital opens with a memorandum of understanding. Without power, the reconstruction conversation is entirely theoretical. Suppose, despite every obstacle described in this video, a Syrian entrepreneur manages to build something. He navigates the rubble monopolies. He sources labor from the diaspora. He finds a generator and pays the warlord's transport fee. He opens a business. His revenue starts to grow. He is visible now. That is when the state arrives. The pattern that has emerged in post-Assad Syria mirrors the old regime closely. Expropriation, reprivatization, and transactions run through front companies, with the broader economy feeding into the same inner circle networks. The tools used are not rifles. They are banking regulations, new tax decrees, retroactive licensing requirements, and sudden compliance demands that only affect businesses outside the protected circle. On taking power, the interim leadership staffed key positions with relatives, citing the need for trusted appointees. Those appointments sit at the intersection of regulatory authority and commercial interest. A decree issued by someone whose family runs a competing logistics firm is not reform. It is market management by other means. The interim government pledged to privatize state-owned companies, halve the size of the public sector, and dismiss roughly 1/3 of state employees. In an economy with over 90% of the population below the poverty line, a rapid privatization without a functioning legal system to enforce contracts is not liberalization. It is a fire sale for the people close enough to the flame. The entrepreneurs who survive in Syria are the ones who found a patron inside the circle. The ones who did not are being systematically returned to zero. Here is the part the diplomatic calendar will never tell you. The UNDP says that even under optimistic scenarios, rebuilding Syria's economy will take at least a decade, and progress is likely to be uneven and fragile. That assessment assumes good faith governance, functional institutions, and an absence of deliberate obstruction. None of those conditions currently apply. GDP contracted by 1.5% in 2024. The IMF confirmed in February 2026 that activity was improving, but from an exceptionally low base. A 1% uptick in a country where 16.5 million people, nearly 70% of the population, still need humanitarian support is not recovery. It is a rounding error dressed up in a press briefing. The system is not broken. A broken system is one that failed by accident. What Syria has is a system that is working exactly as it was designed to work. For a small group at the top who benefit directly from reconstruction money being skimmed, drug networks surviving under new management, electricity remaining scarce enough to force dependence, and the formal economy staying weak enough that the shadow economy never faces real competition. Our entrepreneur in Istanbul has been watching the news. He saw the sanctions lifted. He saw the investment forums. He saw the handshakes. He's still watching because he's smart enough to know that something does not add up. You should be watching the same way. Stop reading the treaty. Start reading the capital flows. Stop tracking the diplomacy. Start tracking who owns the construction contracts, who controls the exchange desk, who got invited into the interim government despite a Washington sanctions file with their name on it. That is where the real story of Syria lives, not in the headlines, in the ledger that nobody is publishing, and that is the video. If this changed how you read a foreign reconstruction story, share it with one person who needs to see it. Subscribe for the kind of analysis that financial media does not slow down long enough to give you.